You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Hi, listeners. Welcome to Economics Detective Radio. I'm Garrett Peterson. Today's guest is Robert H. Frank of Cornell University. Robert, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hi, Garrett. Good to be talking with you.
And good to talk to you, too. So, today we're going to be discussing Robert's book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. It's a book about social influences that we have on one another and the way those the context shapes our decisions and how that relates to economics and policy. So, Dr. Frank, how about you start by giving the sort of elevator pitch of this book and maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to write it?
I've been thinking about ways to extend the standard economic model for a long time now. Mainly, I'm interested in the fact that we seem to pursue a broader mix of aims and objectives than the narrow rational actor model typically assumes. And the starting premise for this book is the old saw from the social psychologists. They say it's the situation, not the person. And by that, what they mean is that when we see somebody do something, our tendency is to look to traits of personality or character. Why would a person do such a thing? They say, no, that's not the fruitful way to think about it. More often, what a person does is explained by the social circumstances in which she was deciding what to do. And so if you're worried that your daughter might become a smoker, it's not helpful to know that she's a science fiction buff or that she's good in math or that she likes sports. None of that is predictive. What you really want to know is how many of her friends smoke, and it's a huge effect. If that number would go from 20 to 30%, for example, she's 25% more likely to become or remain a smoker. So what we do is, to an enormous extent, much more than most of us realize, predicted by what others around us will do. That's often taken as a bad thing, and as parents, we tell kids not to be influenced to do stupid things by what their peers are doing, and that's certainly good advice. But the general impulse, if you see somebody doing something and they're confident about doing it, or more important, if you see many people doing something, that ought to at least kindle in you a feeling that it might be worth investigating whether you ought to be doing that thing too. Maybe it isn't, but you ought at least have an impulse to think about it. So we've known that for a long time. It's true too that the social environment is itself a consequence of what we do. So the smoking rate, what's that? That's just the total number of us who decided to smoke divided by the total number of us. And yet nobody has really thought to question systematically whether there are things we might do to encourage people to act as if they cared about the effects of their own choices on the social environment. Mm-hmm. We typically ignore that effect because it's so small. It's from the individual's point of view negligible, but collectively we constitute the social environment, and if the social environment affects us so strongly, often for ill, as in the smoking case, but in many other cases for good, why not encourage us, if there's any practical way to do that, to behave as if we cared about how we affect the social environment? So that's what the book's really about.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And I love the smoking example because it's so clearly something that, if you were going to model the decline of smoking in, neoclassical terms, it's just like there's been this constant fall in demand for cigarettes or for the act of smoking. And it's just sort of exogenous. There's not really an explanation. Maybe you could say people knew more about the health costs, but that would only really explain a small part of it. But you look around you and you see, people, if you grow up not knowing a single other person who smokes, versus you grow up in knowing where everyone smokes, that's going to have a
it's a
huge
different world.
impact. Yeah.
Yeah, I have 4 adult sons. None of them smokes. I once told a friend that if they'd grown up when I did, at least 2 of them probably would be smokers by now. One of my sons was in the room during this conversation. Yeah, which 2? He wanted to know right away. And I said, well, David, who's my oldest, and then I thought Hayden almost certainly would have smoked. He's my youngest. This was Chris asking the question. He's number 3. He said, what about me? He seemed to feel chagrined that I hadn't thought he would be a smoker. So I don't know. Well, maybe he would have been. So at least 2, maybe 3 of my sons would have smoked. And the reason they weren't smokers was that their friends weren't smokers. And when I grew up, most of my friends were smokers. I started smoking as a teenager. I smoked for a couple of years, but most parents do not want their kids to grow up to be smokers. And I succeeded in raising my kids not to be, not because I'm a great parent. I did what I could to discourage them, but the real reason they didn't smoke is because their friends didn't smoke.
Mm-hmm. And if your peer group's all doing something or not doing something, it's a big influence. And I mean, there's maybe some specific aspects of smoking, like being able to go on a smoke break and socialize with people versus standing alone on your smoke break. But I think the general point about just the way we sort of learn to be members of our society is a lot by mimicking what other people are doing, and by sort of adopting the values and norms of the people around us.
And what's interesting is the pushback I got for suggesting that the measures we took to discourage smoking, we actually did take some pretty concrete and extreme steps. The cigarettes now in New York City, you can't buy a pack for less than $13. I remember buying a pack of Camels in North Carolina for 25 cents when I was a teenager. You can't smoke in public places now. Many buildings, restaurants, bars, all that is off limits. Those were pretty heavy steps to take, and we justified them by saying that we had to protect hapless victims from secondhand smoke. We didn't do those regulations until after Japanese studies showed pretty conclusively that exposure to secondhand smoke was associated with higher incidence of various illnesses. That's true. The effects of secondhand smoke exposure, though, are minuscule compared to the damage that you do to yourself by being a smoker. Okay, maybe you want to say it's not the government's job to protect you from harming yourself. John Stuart Mill did say that when he wrote on liberty in the 19th century, and I remember agreeing with it when I read it, but I think it's a much more interesting question than he realized at the time. I mean, behavioral science has now turned up quite a bit of interesting evidence about what it means to be a person, and why you might, in your 50s, wish somebody had prevented you from doing something stupid when you're in your 20s. But set that to one side. The real harm that you cause when you become a smoker is to make other people more likely to smoke. And that's I call that a behavioral externality. Why shouldn't the government consider policies like taxing cigarettes to discourage you from harming others in that way? There's absolutely no principled reason to differentiate that kind of an externality from the usual externalities that we're willing to regulate without a second thought, like exposure to secondhand smoke and exposure to toxic mercury fumes coming out of smokestacks. We regulate those without needing an excuse. Behavioral externalities are exactly analogous to those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in this sort of viewpoint, maybe the dangers of secondhand smoke really weren't enough to justify the regulation, but it's sort of, but we had this sort of rule that we don't pass laws just for people's own good, and maybe we don't consider social contagion, because just as that's sort of a slippery slope to, there's really, once you start considering social contagion as an externality, there's really no limit to what you can what laws you can pass for people's own good. And I think people, I'm in a bit of a bind here because I really like that I live in a society with where fewer smokers, and that governments in particular took action to curb smoking and this social contagion that it engenders. But at the same time, like I personally, I would like there to be like a clear line that we don't step over, where just in order to not regulate every part of life. Yeah,
I'm very sympathetic to that concern. Nobody wants to live in a nanny state, of course. I think we do have elected representatives. They are responsible to us. We go partway down slippery slopes all the time, and inevitably we have to make judgments about where we draw lines on those slopes. So, especially if you're willing to be flexible about your choice of instruments, as an economist, you'll be sympathetic to this too. Mm-hmm. The idea of taxing a behavioral externality, really, I think, as long as the behavioral externality is one that causes demonstrable harm to others, and as long as we have plausible reasons for believing that the harm it causes to others is of greater value than the benefit from whatever people are doing when they're able to do whatever they want to without any interference from anybody, then taxing that behavior is just the very least intrusive way to make it less attractive. If the problem is that it's too attractive for individuals to engage in it because they don't take into account the harm they cause to others, make it a little less attractive by taxing it. The people who would have the hardest time giving it up, the ones who care most about being free to do it, could still do it. They would pay a price for doing it. But since they're causing harm to others, that seems a just request to make of them. And the icing on the cake is that every dollar we would collect in tax on a behavioral externality is a dollar we wouldn't have to collect on an activity that's actually useful. So right now we tax payrolls. We discourage companies from hiring workers. Why on earth would we want to continue doing that if we could replace those tax dollars with taxes on activities that cause harm to other people?
Yeah. Your section on policy recommendations are I'd say the part of the book that is most clearly written by someone with a background in economics, rather than I think the rest of the book maybe could have been written by a psychologist. But I really like that you. I think a lot of books like this, trying to alert people to a problem, don't go to that extra effort of saying, and here's a good solution as opposed to a less good solution that we might go for. So you, as you said, advocate for what we call sin taxes, or but in this case, since you're arguing that these activities present an exterналity, they're I guess a Pigouvian tax. Trying to counter that effect.
Standard Pigouvian taxation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had Pigou's book now for exactly 100 years. Economics of Welfare was published in 1920. This is not reinventing the wheel here. This is just going back to some long received wisdom about how best to deal with activities that cause harm to others.
Yeah, and as you point out, if we regulate, if we want people to smoke less, so we have lots of regulations on them, it costs the state to enforce those regulations. Whereas if we put taxes on them, it actually brings in revenue. So it's kind of more of a win-win. We get to adjust people's behavior in a way that reduces the negative externality, and we, and also get income. So it's pretty uniformly positive if we tax the right things, of course.
So let me try to draw you out, Garrett, on what your concerns are. Let's imagine that somebody proposes to tax sugared soft drinks. Does that worry you? The idea of doing that?
So let's see, I would be worried about taxes on. Well, okay, yeah. One, I'm worried a little bit about the precedent that just at a certain point, we have no principle about what the state does and doesn't control, and then maybe we end up a lot more totalitarian than we are. But then the other concern just with health things is that health, like what foods are healthy and unhealthy. We've sort of changed our views on that a lot over the past 30 years. So I'd be worried if we started doing that we'd end up taxing or subsidizing the wrong things and actually making people less healthy. But of course, the nice thing about a tax, as you point out, is that it's not a ban. So, there would still be people drinking sodas. And if we found out in 10 years that they're actually super healthy, we could reverse course on that. Whereas if we banned them, we really could. It would be much harder.
Yeah, and you would want to insist on a pretty firm evidentiary basis for enacting any kind of a restriction like that. That's a totally fair demand to impose on the government. And the evidence is pretty clear, I think, in the case of these drinks that, well, first of all, that their contribution to the obesity epidemic is really quite well established, that the consumption of them is socially contagion. That's well known too. If they were more expensive, people would shift to other kinds of drink. We know that. The size of the response to price is fairly muted, I think, for most of our econometric estimates. We would not have expected to see anything like the reduction in smoking rates that we've seen in response to the taxes that we've levied on cigarettes. But we get multiplier effects and big ones from the contagion element of the process. So when some don't start smoking or others manage to quit, that means every peer group has fewer smokers in it. And so you get fewer others starting to smoke, and it ramifies over time. So I think you wouldn't need all that big of a penalty to get a pretty big reduction in the consumption. There are lots of groups where they drink 32-ounce Cokes 2 or 3 times a day. Those kids grow up to be unhealthy, and the parents don't want them to get diabetes when they're in their 20s. They don't want to see them get their toes and feet amputated later in life. But that's the consequence, the known consequence of consuming in certain patterns. And as long as we have a flexible instrument like taxation to try to steer people towards substitute behaviors that are less harmful, then that seems like at least well worth considering.
This is a great opportunity to launch into a personal anecdote. So as a teenager, I made a friend, and they were over at my house, and I offered them a glass of water. And yeah, this was someone who had grown up in a household that just didn't drink water as a habit. They when they were thirsty, they grabbed a Coke. And yeah, that I don't want to attribute it entirely to myself, but that person did lose about 70 pounds over the next few years.
Just from that first taste of water. Hey,
maybe
somebody told me about this.
but I mean, and they say that I maybe missed this in your book, but that person's weight is related to the weight of the other people they interact with. So and of course that would be from behavioral changes. If all your friends are drinking tap water and exercising, then you're going to do it too.
That's one of the signature studies in the contagion field was a very widely cited paper by Nick Christakis and James Fowler, who showed that obesity is very highly contagious. That it's a complicated thing to try to demonstrate statistically, but the likelihood of your becoming obese if an additional person in your circle becomes obese goes up substantially. And there are even natural experiments that speak to that. So when the military sends a family to a new post, one study showed that if the location of the new post had a obesity rate 1% higher than where the family had been, the adult members of that family are 5% more likely to become obese during their stay at the new place. So it's a huge effect. Yeah,
Yeah,
we really are very much influenced by what people around us do.
yeah, and that's I mean that's great because the military would be choosing where to send them, right? Because and that would be outside their control. So and there might even be some kind of it's at the very least exogenous, if not random.
Yes,
So
yeah,
it's a
no,
good study
it's an
design.
econometrician's dream to have a natural experiment like that.
Yeah, because I mean, if we just looked at people who chose where to move, it might be that different people choose different, places with different levels of obesity, and that would confound that result. But with the military
Yes,
assigning you, it's beyond your control.
yes.
So we've talked. All our examples so far of these contagions have been negative things, smoking and obesity. But you have lots of examples in the book of positive sort of social contagions. There's no reason why they have to be bad. Do you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, I think the received wisdom about peer effects has a very negative valence. I was resistant to the idea of having the term peer influence anywhere in the marketing materials or the title or subtitle of the book. When my editor proposed putting peer pressure to work as a subtitle, I thought, well, maybe that has kind of a man bites dog feel to it. Maybe people will wonder what's going on since that's not expected. But the overwhelming impression of people is that peer influences are negative. I think that's almost certainly not true on balance. We know that we're influenced by what others do, good or bad. So if your neighbor puts up a solar panel on his roof and you can see it, if it's facing the street, you're much more likely to put one up than if it's on the back of the house where you can't see it. It's a huge effect if somebody installs a new solar panel array at day one in a zip code. Then 4 months later, on the average, that'll spawn a new one, and again they have to sort out what's causation, what isn't. So that some of the new installations would have occurred anyway, but they've got ways of identifying that pin down pretty closely that a new one comes every 4 months in response to the first one. So then you've got two after 4 months. You've got four after 8 months. After a year, you've got eight. And at the end of 2 years, you've got 32 installations just because somebody decided to put one in on day one. It's a huge contagion, and it goes well beyond the zip code because people know people all over the country that they talk about these things with, and so that spawns contagions elsewhere too that radiate outward. So yeah, there are huge beneficial effects from this kind of influence, and wherever we see those occurring spontaneously, that's at least worth thinking about whether they might be worth stimulating a bit with subsidies or other encouragements. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but at least that's also an interesting question for policymakers to be thinking about.
Yeah, and the great thing about so there's if we wanted every single person to have a solar panel on their roof, there's some level of subsidy that could do that. But the nice thing about this social contagion effect is that really you don't have to pay people that much. If there were no social contagion, you'd maybe need to like fully compensate people for the cost. It would be very expensive to subsidize everyone. But with social contagion,
Exactly.
if you could just pay one person in every neighborhood to get a solar panel,
Yeah, and people
then you get a lot of
and
bang
that's
for your
what we
buck.
did. We did, and people objected. Well, it's rich people who take those subsidies, and that's not fair.
Hmm.
But without the subsidies, nobody would have installed those panels, or very few would have. And then the contagion process sets in. The cost curve comes down dramatically, and now we're phasing the subsidies out, but we don't need them now because now, even in cloudy upstate New York, where I live, solar power is cheaper than gas or coal-fired power.
Hmm.
we're about to move into the renewables age because we accelerated the declining cost curve of renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it's amazing how much of our motivation is not to be just that one weird guy, who even if you really believe in solar power, do you want to be the one person on your block, who stands out like a sore thumb because his roof is covered in solar panels, versus being one of 10. It's just a nicer feeling.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I mean,
you see kids who don't want to wear helmets because the other kids aren't wearing them. My older two sons, I couldn't get them to wear bike helmets. Son number three was in a very bad bike accident. I took him to the emergency room. The ER doc who was treating him came out and showed me his helmet. It was completely shattered on one side of the front of it. He said if he hadn't been wearing this helmet, we'd be discussing funeral arrangements right now instead of me giving you advice about how to care for his broken collarbone. And the only reason he was wearing a helmet, I couldn't get his older brothers to wear one, was that New York State had passed a law a few years earlier saying that nobody under 18 can ride a bike without a helmet. And so with that law, I was able to get my kids to wear helmets. And that particular son is alive today because of that. And you have to ask, why don't people wear helmets? It's because wearing helmets in some circles is just unfashionable. I had a colleague in France the year I was on sabbatical working in Paris. She would ride her bike to the office and almost an hour each way, not wearing a helmet. I teased her once that it must be tough to be such a slave to fashion that you don't feel like you can wear a helmet. And she was, of course, indignant and she was not a particularly fashion conscious person among the people in that office. So it was really an unfair charge to level against her. But then a couple of weeks later, she came into my office and said sheepishly that she'd gone to a store and tried on some helmets over the weekend. And just the moment she saw herself in the mirror, realized that there's no way I'd be willing to be seen riding a bike in public wearing one of those. Really, all you need is a fraction of the people to be wearing helmets, and then suddenly you don't look like a dork if you're wearing one. So if we wouldn't even have to force people to wear helmets. We could say, all right, you like riding with the wind in your hair, you pay for a decal that you can put on your motorcycle, and then you can ride without a helmet. You've paid your fee for the right to do that. Not everybody would pay the fee. If even 25% or 30% of the riders wore helmets, that's all you would need to remove the stigma from wearing them. You could wear one and people wouldn't think you were a wimp. They'd think you were just smart enough not to pay that stupid fee. So yeah, there are ways to solve these kinds of social influence problems.
Yeah, and you go to a different. It's definitely not random. You go to different cities, and you can see, differences in the way, in definitely helmet wearing, but things like jaywalking. And you visit some cities, and everyone jaywalks, and other cities they're all waiting for the light.
Yeah, and you immediately sense which one you're in. If you jaywalk in certain cities, I'm used to New York, where everybody jaywalks. It's just almost a social norm that you're supposed to jaywalk whenever you can cross safely without waiting for the light to be in your favor. But other cities, boy, you immediately sense the social disapproval when you step off the curb, when the light's not with you.
Yeah, and I think I try not to talk too much about the pandemic on this show, just because it's so all consuming. But I think if your book had been was being released next year, being written now, you'd probably discuss mask wearing, during this the COVID-19 pandemic, how countries that have a norm of that. Yeah,
it's very subject to social influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if everyone else around you does
behavior.
It, of course you will.
The objection to Pence not wearing a mask when he visited the Mayo Clinic was less that he was putting people at risk, which of course he was doing, but as he pointed out, he gets regularly tested, so he probably wasn't putting them at much risk, but just modeling that it's okay to be in an environment without wearing a mask was very hard to defend when now the medical opinion is so decisively in favor of the helpfulness of wearing masks in avoiding transmission.
Mm-hmm. So one of the really interesting things in your book was you discussed political and social changes, like the sort of rapid public perception change with respect to gay marriage. That it went from America went from a society where most people at least publicly stated opposition to it to one where most people support it in a relatively short period of time. And you talk about the summer of love and the sexual revolution, and those I'm interested in those kind of social changes and the sort of cascade that happens. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, it's a complicated world out there. If you would ask your fellow graduate students to explain why slavery is considered morally wrong, I'm guessing that many of them couldn't give you a very articulate summary of the philosophical arguments that decided the case many decades ago. This was once something that people actually argued very seriously about. Those days are gone. It is now settled opinion that slavery is morally wrong. People don't come into the world with fixed belief about issues like that, but most people you would ask today, is slavery morally wrong, would say, of course. They couldn't explain why, but that's actually, in a way, a good thing. We've kind of settled that issue. We've moved on, and there's so many issues like that where we have no idea what to believe. Is same-sex marriage okay? How would you know unless you were very closely connected to somebody who was involved in a difficult case directly involved with that? So you believe what other people believe, and so when polls were taken in the 1980s, 90% of people surveyed thought it was absolutely wrong that they should that there should be marriage between people of the same sex. Now there are substantial majorities, 2/3 of majorities in virtually every state of the union that say yes. Why should we prohibit people from marrying whomever they choose? And so once the tide starts to shift, you start seeing people who say, yes, that's okay. Well, then it's safe for you to say you believe changes in the wake of that. So, yeah, we see cascades that are very powerful in this domain.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that at the start of Barack Obama's first term in office, it was he and Hillary Clinton were still publicly opposed to gay marriage because you just had to be it was still enough of a third rail that the left-wing party was not willing to publicly say they supported it.
And I'm guessing that you feel sure, I know I feel sure, that both of them wished they could have said when the California referendum was in play in early 2009, they wished they could have said, yes, we support this. But they felt it was unsafe to say that. Now, just less than a decade later, we've got virtually everybody saying, what's the big deal?
Yeah, it's it's shocking, kind of. I mean, with politicians, though, you really get the sense that their stated beliefs are the result of a group of pollsters and political operatives sort of saying, like, this will play well in these swing states and this won't. Don't say that. So it's the third party candidates who get up and just say what they think, and of course they for many reasons don't win elections. But yeah, it's funny because you wonder if people, rather than saying what polls indicate they should say would just, get up and say the emperor has no clothes if they could have just triggered people to say, actually, I've changed my mind. But I mean, you can only do that so much before you just, lose all the elections and have no influence or power anymore.
Yeah, it's a very fine line to walk. But when we see someone who's able to break ranks with established opinion and defend his or her own opinion in a thoughtful way, we have special admiration for people like that. Mario Cuomo used to veto the state legislature's death penalty bills that they would keep sending him. The death penalty was quite popular then, and the legislature several times passed bills to reinstate it in New York. Mario Cuomo, repeatedly vetoed those, and I think he was a sufficiently visibly morally thoughtful man that people were willing to grant him the benefit of the doubt on those vetoes. Yes, he was doing it because he felt capital punishment was morally indefensible. Most politicians were worried that a veto like that would signal to voters that they weren't tough on crime, but we admired Cuomo because he didn't feel he needed to send a signal like that.
But it's one way to sort of think about this is you've got kind of a weirdness budget that, if you earn people's respect by being like, solid and normal most of the time, then you can maybe on one issue say, no, I'm taking a stand. I don't believe in this one thing that most other people express belief in. But I guess what comes to mind is someone like Jeremy Bentham 200 years ago saying that they should legalize sodomy, which of course didn't happen until fairly late in the 20th century. But he was weird on so many things, and so of course other philosophers listened, but regular people didn't go, this Jeremy Bentham guy, he's got lots of weird ideas, and let's adopt them all.
Right. Here's a thing that I've changed my mind about since working on this project, and that's the traditional economics profession's stance on what's referred to as conscious consumption. I don't know if the term's familiar. It's the individual steps people take to lower their carbon footprint. So you walk instead of drive, you eat meat less often, you buy a hybrid instead of a gas engine car, things of that sort. The economics community, and I was definitely on their side with this, used to think of those moves as just a distraction at best. They were deflecting attention from the real imperative in the climate movement, which is to enact a stiff carbon fee and dividend policy and undertake massive investment in decarbonization of various forms. If we don't do those things, none of those other individual steps are going to matter. So that was my view too, but I've completely changed my mind on that. It was partly because of the contagion effects that you see. I described the size of them in the solar panel adoption example. They're huge sometimes. So yes, the individual step you take won't have much effect on the environment, but the indirect effects of what you do through contagion are often enormous. And so they're anything but negligible. But more important than that, I think, is to think about identity in more along the lines of Aristotle's model and less along the lines of economists. Typically, we assume people come into the world with fully formed identities and preferences. No, Aristotle said you become who you are gradually over time. We are what we repeatedly do, was one summary of his thinking about that. And so when you take these steps, you incur costs to state that you think the environment is important and you're willing to make sacrifices to help protect it. You create or strengthen your identity as a climate advocate, and in the process, you become much more likely to vote for the candidates who will adopt carbon fees to not only vote for them, but to write checks to their campaign committees, go out and knock on doors to help get them elected, you actually help promote the policies that we've long argued are what are necessary to make things happen in the climate arena. So I no longer think of those steps as distractions. They're useful steps along the path to the policy changes that we need.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think in the past I've expressed irritation with people who, go to great lengths to recycle a trivial number of plastic bottles, but then, casually fly around the world to go on vacation. When, of course,
Right.
Just numbers wise, that one international flight is canceling out, maybe a million years of recycling. But yeah, I guess if I was going to sort of summarize your general point, it's that social contagion makes everything we do that other people see us doing and can be influenced by, it's just a multiplier effect. So if we do something bad like smoking or taking silly risks like riding a bicycle without a helmet, it's even worse because other people see that and it affects them. And if we do something good, even if it's just small or even trivial, it's like publicly, making a point of recycling, then, it's possibly there's this multiplier is a positive thing and the effect is bigger than one would estimate from just looking at the effect of the bottle itself.
Yeah, that's the first observation of the book, which is the psychologist's maxim. It's the situation, not the person. So yes, we have enormous influence beyond what we normally think of. But the punchline of the book is that we should exploit that fact whenever we find simple policy levers that will encourage us to behave as if we cared about the effects we have on others. It's not reasonable, I don't think, to expect people just to get there on their own. We really have every reason to think about encouraging people to take the changes to heart that will have external effects on others, both positive and negative.
Mm-hmm. And as you point out, some of these interventions are extremely cheap. And just our discussing the fact that Vice President Pence didn't wear a mask when a face mask when addressing the public during a pandemic. Right. That would have cost the government, what's the cost of a mask? Less than $1, right? But probably would have had a significant effect on people seeing that, changing their behavior, and then potentially fewer people dying, fewer people contracting a deadly disease. So, yeah, some of these interventions are just cost. You can round to $0 or even save or earn money, and they can have potentially big effects.
The venture capitalists have a term, they talk about a green field. They mean, for example, when the iPhone came out, there were probably scores, maybe hundreds of products and services that could never have existed before the iPhone. And once the iPhone appeared, there was essentially a gold rush. Companies and entrepreneurs scrambling to develop these new products and services that were now made possible by the existence of the smartphone. And I think of the policy options that we have at our disposal to encourage behaviors that have positive behavioral externalities and discourage those ones that have negative behavioral externalities. That's a public policy greenfield. We have not taken anything like full advantage of the opportunities that are out there. So I think if the book can encourage some people to start thinking more seriously about how we might do that, I'll be so pleased that it achieved my fondest hope for it.
Mm-hmm. So we can talk a little bit more about your policy section. There's something you call the mother of all cognitive illusions. Do you want to say what that is and why it's related to this topic?
Well, if you think about the two main crises that we face, one is the pandemic. That's the one that, as you point out, has everybody's attention to the exclusion of almost everything else. The other one is the climate crisis. If you stand back a few paces, it's by far the more serious of the two. If the pandemic got no response, there would be a horrible couple of years as it rushed through the populations around the world, and anywhere from a half of 1% to 2 or 3% of the world's population would be left dead in its wake. But then that would be the end of it. The warming crisis is one that threatens, if not permanent extinction of all life. That's been one of the options if we take no action to limit warming, but radical degradation of life on the earth if we don't take immediate and radical action to help curb the warming process. It's the far bigger threat. We think less about it, primarily, I think, because it's less immediate. But the two crises have a common cause, and it's that we haven't been willing to spend the money to take the action that would make both of them less of a threat. So we could have built hospitals with great surge capacity. We could have invested a lot more in medical research and vaccine development than we have. The pandemic groups were launched, but then disbanded because we weren't willing to spend the money on that. In the climate case, it would be enormously expensive to do the investments we need to do, many trillions of dollars a year, but we've done that in the past, as when we mobilized in World War II. We know we can do that, but we don't do it because we say, oh, it's too expensive. We would have to give up things we care about. And what I call the mother of all cognitive illusions is the belief, it's widespread and it's held by people up and down the ladder, but most importantly by prosperous taxpayers, of which I'm one. It's the idea that if they tax me more heavily to pay for these public investments, I won't be able to buy the special extras in life that I want. I can't really pretend to be worried that I won't be able to buy what I need. Nobody's got a tax proposal on the table that would threaten that. So what am I worried about? That I won't be able to get the things that make life special, apartments with 360-degree views of the city, for example, other things that there aren't enough of. How do you get those things? You get them by outbidding other people like you who also want them. And here's what people don't realize. If your taxes go up, and if the taxes of people like you also go up, your relative bidding power for the special extras in life is completely unchanged by that. The same penthouse apartments end up in the same hands as before. People don't naturally think about it that way. They think, oh, how will I feel if my taxes go up? Well, they can't do the natural thought experiment, which is to try to remember how you felt the last time they went up, because there hasn't been in your lifetime a time when taxes went up significantly. If you're a prosperous voter, that just hasn't happened. In the U.S., they were 92% in World War II. They're now 37%. It's been a straight downward slope with a couple of minor exceptions, too small even to notice or remember. So what do? You think about the times when you had less income because you know the taxes are going to leave you with less income. And each of those times that you can remember were times when you felt horrible. You got divorced, you had less income, you had a bad business year or a health crisis or a home fire. Maybe your kid got arrested. You had to hire an expensive attorney. You had less income to spend then. But in each of those cases, you had less income, but everybody else had the same amount of income as usual. And so in each of those cases, you really were worse off. You really were less able to bid for the special extras that you crave. But that's not what happens when everybody pays higher taxes. So I think if everybody were aware that the natural way of thinking about the effect of higher taxes is just a cognitive illusion, we'd be much more willing to enact the policies that we need to enact in order to have surge capacity in the hospitals, greater investment in medical research, greater investment in decarbonizing the economy, and those other steps that we know we should take, but are for some reason reluctant to take because we don't want to give up the immediate pleasures of private consumption.
Okay, so you're saying that the effect of my income holding everyone else's income constant on my well-being is, larger. It has a bigger effect on the margin than if you change my income and everyone else's because of these positional goods or these these things that we're all maybe bidding on that that have a relatively fixed supply that would be cheaper if everyone had less money.
That's a broader category of things than most people realize. I mean, you want a fast car. Well, what's fast? Fast means relatively fast in the current context. In 1920, if your car would have gotten to 60 miles an hour eventually, it would have seemed unbelievably fast. And, now it's got to get to 60 miles an hour in under 5 seconds, or it seems sluggish. So context shapes what we feel we need. There's a very large, very contentious literature on the determinants of human flourishing, but one of the one robust findings in it is that beyond a certain point, and it's one we've passed long since in the West, further increases in most forms of private consumption serve only to raise the bar that defines what we think of as adequate. So wedding receptions in the U.S. now average $36,000 in real dollars. In 1980, there were 12,000. Nobody's any happier because everybody's spending 3 times as much. It's just now you're expected to spend at a higher level or else be considered as someone who didn't appreciate what a special occasion it was that you were hosting. So we could divert the dollars that have been used to buy bigger cars and bigger houses and more lavish celebrations into these other areas, which are known to make a difference in people's health and well-being without any sense of sacrifice at all. That's the irony of it.
Right. So, I mean, that's a great point. On the other hand, there's something to be said for the absolute level of, real resources we dedicate to consumer goods and how that can, the faster car, part of it is social, but part of it is you get where you're going faster. And so I guess it comes down to really an empirical question of like how much of what we buy or, how much of what is available on the market is this is like positional or social, and would actually give us more value per dollar if everyone were taxed more or just had less to spend on it, versus things that we spend more on them and we just get more out.
I think that's a totally good question to be focused on, and that really does direct your attention to the choice of instrument that you use for raising this revenue. And it's long been my advocacy of the progressive consumption tax that I think would be the most fruitful approach to this problem. So throw the income tax out the window, adopt a much more steeply progressive consumption tax. What's that? You declare your income to the IRS just as you do now. Maybe we should simplify the process, which we could do and should do. Then you document how much you added to your stock of savings during the year. That's your annual savings. The difference between those two numbers, your income minus your savings, that's your consumption. That's how much you spent during the year. We have a very low tax rate or a zero tax rate on that when the number is small. And we have a big standard exemption to allow for the fact that people at low incomes consume virtually all their income. But once we get up to where your taxable consumption, your income minus your savings minus the big standard exemption, is $4 million, $5 million, $6 million a year, the rates can be very high on the next dollar you consume. And we're not worried about choking off savings and investment. On the contrary, that would stimulate additional savings and investment. And can you identify consumption at that level that you don't think of as largely positional? It's very difficult to actually sit down and make a list of we're going to describe the things people buy when they've already spent $2 or $3 million on personal consumption. Which of those things is not very highly positional in nature. The yacht that's 600 feet long rather than 500 feet long. The things that people are spending at that level are things that no one needs, that just raise the bar, that establishes how much you need in order to be able to hold your place in the queue.
Right, because it's the, the first dollar you earn is the one you spend on being able to get, a meal and just enough calories and clean water and a roof over your head. That's all, stuff you buy with with the first dollar, the first bit of your income, and then the last dollar you spend in the year, the marginal dollar, the one that you wouldn't spend if you were $1 poorer, as you say, is the stuff that maybe you don't need so much. Getting a little extra RAM in your computer if that's something you value, or a bigger boat, or it depends on your income level.
And the other thing is that if you phase this in gradually, and when the economy is in a downturn would be the way to do it. So you pass a law saying that as soon as the unemployment rate gets back down to a certain level, we're going to start taxing consumption. That would create a massive stimulus to the economy, as wealthy people would rush to get their luxury products in hand before the consumption tax got enacted. So you'd see then a gradual shift between, once the tax was online, you'd see a shift away from consumption toward investment. That would mean a more rapid rate of growth of productivity over time. That would mean income would grow more rapidly. And so even though you'd be consuming a smaller fraction of national income in equilibrium along the growth path, the absolute level of consumption, which is the thing you were worrying about missing out on, would actually be higher under the new trajectory than under the old one. It's just failure to take advantage of golden opportunities that are staring us in the face.
Mm-hmm. So we're running up on time here. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts, any general ideas that you'd like someone who's listened to this whole conversation to take away from it?
I think the difficult thing with ideas in the current climate is that we're highly polarized. It's very difficult to get somebody who doesn't agree with you in the first place to react in a neutral or thoughtful way to anything that you might tell her or him. The last chapter in the book is devoted to what researchers have learned about how to communicate more effectively with people who don't agree with you in the first place. So we know that when Al Gore would announce a new study showing that warming was occurring faster than we thought, people who didn't think there was any climate change going on became ever more determined to resist measures to mitigate climate change. So do no harm is kind of the first rule, but if you want to make progress, don't try to explain anything to people. Just engage them in conversation, listen attentively, and the way progress occurs in conversations, this is what the people who study conversations in detail have learned, is when somebody asks the right question. And so an example of that for me, from my experience, was when I would try to explain to opponents of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, why the mandate was necessary. The mandate was the requirement that you buy insurance, whether you wanted to or not. The opponents of Obamacare hated the mandate. Oh, that was a gross violation of their freedom. You could try to explain to them why the insurance pools wouldn't be stable without that, but they wouldn't listen long enough for that conversation to go anywhere. I discovered completely by accident once when I asked this question: what do you think would happen if the government required home insurers to sell fire insurance at reasonable rates to people after their houses had already burned down?
Yeah.
You don't have to think long about that question. First of all, people who don't like Obamacare don't seem to feel threatened by that question. They think about it and then they say, oh, the insurance companies would go bankrupt in short order if we did that. Why? Because Why would anybody buy home insurance before his house burned down if you could buy it at affordable rates after your house burned down? And once they've seen that, then they conclude without being prompted, hey, the guy with pre-existing conditions. I'm in favor of the Obamacare provision that says you have to sell health insurance to that guy at affordable rates. You can't sell health insurance to that guy at affordable rates. He's the guy whose house is already burned down. The insurance company knows he's going to cost millions of dollars to cover. He knows it. The only way you can get that guy covered is if everybody's in the pool, and they're not going to be in the pool without a mandate. Why don't you need one for the home insurers? Because nobody knows whether his house is going to burn down. The insurance company doesn't know, and you don't know. That's why you're in the pool. So if you ask the right question, you'll make way quicker progress than if you just go in there determined to convince somebody that they're right, that they're wrong, and you're right. That doesn't work.
That's a really good point to end off on. So we'll conclude the interview. For the audience, the book is Under the Influence: Putting Peer Pressure to Work. I'll have a link to it at economicsdetective.com on the show notes page for this episode. My guest today has been Robert Frank. Robert, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, nice to have chatted with you, Garrett.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you want to discuss the show, I encourage you to join our Facebook group. That's Economics Detective on Facebook. You just need to answer a few questions. It's a closed group, and then I'll let you in, and you can talk with other listeners, respond to specific episodes, even suggest future topics and guests there. That's a good place to do it. I want to also say a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. Patreon allows them to make a small recurring donation for each episode I release, just nudging me in the direction of doing more interviews and releasing more episodes. I would probably do it either way, but it's really nice to have that encouragement that people are listening and enjoying the show, and to offset the costs of making it. So special thanks to everyone who supports me there, and if you want to become a Patreon supporter, you can go to patreon.com/economicsdetective. Thanks, and I'll be back soon with another episode.